So, a couple months back, when John Wick 4 was just around the corner, I felt intrigued to actually watch the current 3 films in the franchise before going to see Chapter 4. And with me really loving Bond vs. Wick, I put it at number 5 on my Death Battle Season 9 ranking for a reason, I decided to go through with it. And now that I've seen all 4 movies, what did I think of them? Since that I haven't branched out much from things like Death Battle and Mario, aside from that Home Alone video, I figured I might as well talk about them. You know, get some variety around here. There are plenty of other videos on different topics that I'd love to and will make in the future, but as for now, let's see if I think these movies deserve their good reputations. Now, before we start for real, I really recommend checking out all of these movies for yourself. If it's still in theaters by the time this video comes out, then I highly encourage you to go see Chapter 4 there, because that is an experience unlike any other I've had at the movies in a long time. Anyways, now that that is out of the way, let's get to the first movie. So, this is where it all started. In order for this series to be as big as it is, it needed to have a killer introduction, and I think they were able to do just that. Of course, being the first movie, things don't get as intense or dramatic as how they do later in the series, which is kind of why I like looking at this film like its own standalone thing. Now, I'm not proclaiming that this film is better off being separated from the main storyline. It's just, I feel like this movie has a bit more of an identity to itself that differentiates from the rest of them. Whereas the next 3 movies follow John's adventures on returning to the Continental and his former life as the Baba Yaga, this one more serves the purpose to set up John Wick as a character, showing us how truly unstoppable he is, how he can take down armies of men single-handedly, and how he'll do anything to get his payback. This was more of John's personal story, while the next 3 mainly focus on him and the Continental, which is why the organization is mainly an outlet for John to ease back into assassination. We open up on John already at a tragic point in his life. We see just a glimpse of what he had with his loving wife, and how she was taken from him so soon. We already at this point see Wick broken. We can see how this has made his life so bleak, and that's helped by the lighting, with barely any vibrance to be seen. A specific thing that I really admire in all of these movies is the lighting and color. Like I just said, the tone in this one indicates John's current desolate mental state. Later, however, when he's back in action, there are many points where there's just so many popping colors. It's as if this life makes him feel alive. It kind of reflects what Santino says to him in Chapter 2 about him being addicted to the lifestyle, addicted to revenge. However, I'll get to that and some other instances when we get to it. Now, as you probably know, the dog that Wick receives isn't just a normal dog. It's a last gift from his wife before she leaves into the afterlife for good. That dog is one final memoir, and an opportunity to love again. That letter Helen gives John is, honestly, just beautiful. It even made me cry just from the wording and the sheer emotion coming from Keanu. By the way, Keanu Reeves is genuinely perfect casting for this character. He's able to convey every single limit of John's emotional range, and somehow able to make stoicness seem so absurdly chilling, helped by the fact that throughout the entirety of the 4 movies, to my knowledge at least, John never smiles once. I'm really glad that my impressions of him being the Reddit funny man were untrue, because he is a lot deeper than that. This is why you never trust Reddit kids. Ever. After he gets the dog, named Daisy by the way, you can see things starting to turn the other way. Not completely, but things seem to be looking up. Until, well, things come crashing down almost instantly when a few gangsters break into his house, steal his car, and kill his dog. For those unfamiliar with the story of Wick, it's pretty much spelled out for you in the next scene, when the committer of the act returns and his father gives him just a clue about how much he's screwed up. Hell, just Vigo saying his name strikes so much fear into Yosef. And we get to see that it was the last straw for John. He is completely pissed now. He had lost so much, and as soon as he had a slight glimmer of hope to be happy again, that was taken away almost immediately. As Vigo said, his alias might be the Baba Yaga, but he isn't the boogeyman. He's the one you send to kill the boogeyman. After this point, while Wick is the main character, the movie feels like an outsider's perspective. You are constantly shown through speech and proof just how dangerous Wick is. He may be up against impossible odds, but to us and the people in the movie, he is the impossible odds. It's kind of like a reverse slasher movie. And that is an allegory that is proven by the fights. All the big fights in these series have a sort of formula to them. It's almost always Wick in a building or scenario, gunning down enemies as they come to him one by one as he's avoiding death at every turn. Sure, all of them may have the same concept, but they're all ridiculously fun. And in my opinion, what makes the franchise so great? Of course, I really like the story, which surprisingly is very deeply explored and compelling. But these 5-minute long shaky panning camera weapon fights is what these films are known for, and it's no surprise why. And this one has plenty. From the club, John escaping the Tarasov, and the car fight. Carfu, if you will. One-on-one action is pretty prominent too. The final fight between John and Vigo is very well done. This side note, but Rain is one of my favorite set pieces for climatic moments and fights. It just fits so well. John Wick never misses with its fight scenes. Or his bullets, for that matter. There's also the fight he has with Miss Perkins in the hotel, where we get to see Wick's quick thinking and improv skills. One of my favorite things that this film does and the others don't is how they treat injuries. Sure, it is really cool to see John walk off getting shot point blank or getting his finger chopped off, but here, the way they directed it, and the way that John has to rest after taking such a beating, it makes it feel like the stuff he goes through actually hurts and takes a toll on him. It shows you that while he's ridiculously tough, he's not invincible. He's a human. Overall, this was a really great way to introduce us to this universe. It is mostly about letting us get to know John, but there are some core aspects and characters that are important in later films, such as what happens when you're excommunicado, or how the Continental works in general. Also, I'm glad John got another dog at the end. Not only is it just sweet, but it also symbolizes John giving himself the chance to love again. It's just a nice little bit of symbolism there. Sorry if I sound like an English teacher. Despite how great this film was, it was still the first one, meaning it was pretty rough around the edges, and you could definitely tell that they weren't planning a sequel when they made this, because this one doesn't end off on a huge cliffhanger like 2 and 3 do. I heard it was intended to be a trilogy before they went and made 4, so I might be wrong about that statement, but nevertheless, due to its success, we got more content from the Black-Clad Boogeyman anyways. 2.5 more years later, in 2017, we got the second installment. Let's see how it holds up to the first. Okay, I'm not gonna beat around the bush. John Wick 2 is a massive step up from the first, and Chapter 1 was already really good. Chapter 2 surpasses its predecessor in almost every way. I did say almost, however, so I might as well talk about that point really quickly. The villain is probably my least favorite from the series. While 3 didn't really have a defined main villain, the closest we got to that was Zero and the Adjudicator, more specifically the High Table, and even them and Vincent de Gramont posed a bigger threat to Wick, while Vigo held more personal stakes for him. Santino de Antonio doesn't really hold much of a candle to those in terms of those traits. Not saying he's absent of them or that he isn't a good antagonist, I just feel like when compared to the other dangers John faced, he had the smallest impression on me. Basically everything else though is a huge improvement, mainly the fights. There's a lot more of them and they're a lot more creative, well choreographed, and shot. A special shout out to the final battle in the museum and Reflections of the Soul. Not only is it just visually stunning, but A Hall of Mirrors is the perfect unique set piece for an action flick like this. Constantly guessing if someone is really there, seeing the fights from many angles at once, the suspense, the music, the constant action. It's stunningly spectacular. John Wick movies always thrive in its final onslaught, and this is no different. Speaking of, I really love how innovative this series is. From all the ways that unfortunate victims in John's path are executed, including some with the fabled number 2 pencil, to types of fights that really stretch the possibilities of what they can do in different settings, like a dark fight in the catacombs of Rome, or many one-on-ones back-to-back throughout the streets of New York. It really keeps things from getting stale. Just like the former, the story of this chapter isn't too complex, but it does go a bit farther in depth than what the original did with its pretty basic revenge plotline. It isn't until the next 2 where things start getting a bit more complicated. We get introduced to this system known as the markers, which are basically like an IOU or an unbreakable promise or something, I don't really know. Anyways, now that people think he's back in the game, Wick is stuck with this job to kill a member of the High Table, basically the big bosses of the organization, so that Santino can take their place. So yeah, quite simple, but the events that occur are still ridiculously fun. Especially Wick gunning down so many enemies while the intense party music plays in the background. I'm not gonna lie, that's probably one of my favorite action pieces in the entire series. There are some minor antagonists, such as Cassian and Ares, which are more so obstacles, but the multiple tussles they have with the Baba Yaga are pretty well done, just like all the others. And former characters like Winston and Sharon make a return as well. And then there's John's new dog who lives throughout the rest of the franchise. You love to see it. Yeah, it's basically just the definition of a sequel. A souped-up experience that delivers more on what the first couldn't. The fights are better and full of more life and creativity than ever. We see some new faces and aspects exclusive to this world. And, yeah, it's a really, really fun journey. The ending, though, leaves off on a massive cliffhanger. We saw in the previous movie what happens when you break the rules of the Continental with the fate of Miss Perkins. So, with D'Antonio barely escaping John's wrath, he pulls out a dirty trick and takes refuge in the Continental Hotel, the one place he knows he can't be harmed without Wick facing the consequences. However, that's not enough to stop him. Even the threat of excommunication doesn't put any hesitation on John's mind. Despite knowing what will happen if he does what he wants to do, he does it anyway, and quote-unquote finishes it, before finally taking the advice of Winston and walking away. Speaking of Winston, it's nice to see him try to talk John out of killing Santino. It shows that the two do have a genuine friendship, and when Winston has to excommunicate him or whatever else, it's not out of malice or hatred. He legitimately doesn't want to do it. Speaking of excommunication, however, that is now what John has placed on him. And with the open contract that Santino placed earlier still active, now worsened thanks to his murder, and with the Continental Organization itself now after him, that left the door wide open for Chapter 3. Just the thought of Wick would have to go through left many intrigued on what would happen in it. Speaking of the third, let's move on over to it. After I mention a few more things, despite me vastly preferring this one to the first, it didn't really introduce much new that stuck with me. Sure, there are characters like Cassian, Ares, and Santino, which I really do like as one-off characters, but they don't really leave quite the same impression on me as other characters from the franchise do. And after this, there are some concepts that are just not really explored anymore, like the system of the markers and the supposed homeless people who are working for the Bowery King. Speaking of the Bowery King, however, he's one of the few new things introduced in this movie that actually stick on throughout the rest of the series. And actually, I'm really glad he did because he's such an enjoyable character. I just really love his sarcastic nature. Even though many things are one-and-done deals here, I'm really glad we got a lot more world building here. I was intrigued by the system of the Continental in the first one, but this one made me full-on interested. And I couldn't wait to see what other secrets were going to be unveiled in the other two. So, let's just get on to it. This movie released scarily close to Endgame and still somehow managed to do well at the box office. That's impressive. This is the one I have the least to say specifically about. It opens up and we get right to it. John running frantically through the streets of the Big Apple trying to do everything he can before his time runs out, and he's officially labeled as excommunicado, including running into this really tall guy named Ernest who proves that the knowledge of books does in fact bring you power. When they said words can hurt, I don't think this is what they meant. When time runs out, we have this 10-minute action sequence with John running around and getting himself into multiple squabbles with whoever is brave enough, which seems to be a lot of people. Honestly, I don't get why people even try, to be honest. The success rate against him isn't that high, if there is one at all. But anyway, back on track. Can I just say that Chapter 3 has some of my favorite action sequences in the whole series. All in all, might just have my overall favorites. Not only are they easily the most unique out of all of them, with John fighting on horses and motorcycles, tag teaming with Sophia and her dog, 2-on-1s, it's great. And John gets to prove, yet again, that nothing is safe in his hands, like makeshift guns, his own belt, and on the topic of horses, yeah. It's just fun to see a guy do so much awesome stuff. This is why I love these kinds of movies. Speaking of fights, they get pretty intense here. There's just so much going on every single second, and each battle is able to differ itself so greatly from the other. So while they are littered throughout the flick, I never get bored of them since all of them have its own spin. And hey, we even got some new fresh faces around here. I liked the Adjudicator well enough. I thought that their stoicness gave off such a sense of authority, as well as a feeling of eeriness behind the scenes of the High Table. Sophia and her dogs I really liked too. Not much in her specifically, I just found the few scenes she was in to be really fun. And last but not least, we have Zero. He was pretty okay. I liked him well enough as a minor antagonist and thought the fight between him and John, as well as the fight against his two students, were really, really good. Normally not a huge fan of this character trope, but I mean, I thought he was pretty alright for what he was given. There's the stuff with the Elder too, I guess. Yeah, they kind of brushed over that in my opinion. There is so much that you could explore with the concept of the Elder. Someone of greater power than the High Table has so much potential, but he feels more like a destination. And heck, not even at the end of the journey. He's kind of just a checkpoint. As when John finally reaches him, we still have like half the movie left. John just shows up to him in the middle of the desert, makes a deal with him about how to get out of excommunication, cuts off his finger, and then leaves. Even in the fourth movie, John just meets with the new Elder and kills him immediately. Maybe they just didn't have much they actually wanted to do with the concept, But I feel like they could have done a lot more with this concept. He isn't really built up to a whole lot and doesn't really have a huge presence in the film. Makes the title seem kinda small despite how big it's said to be. Switching topics, let's talk about this film's visuals. Easily the most stunning in the 4 films. Granted, it's mainly just in the first little bit in New York with the nighttime, rain, and multicolored lights popping in our eyes, as well as the final battle, but there were plenty of other parts in the movie that did give me a visual treat. And speaking of that final battle, just like I said with 1 and 2, the finale is amazing. Told you they never miss. As I said before, the battle inside the Continental and with Zero and his goons is really well choreographed. And when all is said and done, we get to the scene atop the roof, where Winston pulls a fast one, betrays John, and gets him sent off the roof. Dang. As I said previously, Winston didn't do this out of malicious intent. He really didn't want to do it. He just knew that John was sent to kill him, and his desire to survive was just too great. He really saw no other way to please the High Table. Hell, John isn't even that pissed at him, since they make up pretty quickly in the 4th one. After that scene, however, comes easily my favorite cliffhanger out of the 2 we have. I know, major competition, right? But with Wick's body gone, brought to the Bowery King, who has been stripped of all of his former resources for helping John previously, all he has to say to John is a question, asking him if he's pissed. And with all of his injuries on his face, Wick responds with a simple, yeah, before the screen cuts to black. I don't know about you, but that honestly kind of gave me chills when I saw it for the first time. I'm really glad I saw these movies back to back, because it would have been hell to wait a couple of years to see what happens next. Speaking of what's next, we're already at the end of the road, the final chapter. Literally. All I have left to say before we embark onto the final segment is my overall thoughts on Chapter 3. Do I like it more than the first and second? Gonna be honest, I'm not sure. I really loved it, but there's just something about it that doesn't make it noticeably superior like the second one was. Which prompts me into wondering. So for now, I'll say that I like 2 a bit more and think it's slightly better than 1. But that'll probably change whenever it wants. However, now it's time for the grand finale, supposedly. Let's see how Chapter 4 compares to the rest of these movies. A conclusion. The end of the journey. Something that leaves the characters off in a manner that closes a story for good. This is most likely how you'll remember a show, movie, game, whatever, and its characters. So, in order for it to truly captivate your audience, you have to nail it. You only get one shot to end things off. Most media, despite their quality in of itself, struggle to achieve this. Even some of my favorites have finales that I don't really get a kick out of. There are some out there, however, that truly gave us exactly what we wanted, like Avatar: The Last Airbender, Gravity Falls. Even Toy Story 3 and 4 and Avengers Endgame could have been great closers if Disney hadn't decided to be themselves. And after seeing it, pondering it for a couple of months, I can safely say that John Wick Chapter 4 is one of those endings. It isn't just a great conclusion, but I'd go as far to say it's one of the greatest action films ever made. It's far from perfect, I mean, no movie is, but for what it strives for, it succeeds at, and it succeeds hard. The action is just as great as ever, the stakes just as high, and the story goes all out. It simply is an amazing experience. The plot seems kinda simple on paper, but for what it is, it hits every single beat of what could possibly go on in this. I wish I could show a whole lot more footage on this movie, but unfortunately, the only footage available for me right now are the trailers. But honestly, that works out really well because this is a film you absolutely need to see for yourselves. If it is somehow still in theaters by the time I get this out, then please go see it. If it isn't anymore, then watch it anyway, after you've seen the other three, of course. This was such a great send-off to John Wick as a character. Not John Wick as a franchise, because we are still getting spin-offs and such, like the movie Ballerina and the series The Continental, which have been confirmed projects coming out in the future. So it is obvious that this universe still has a ton left to be explored. But looking back on all of these movies as John's story, it makes it feel so much more grand. A man living in a world where everyone either fears or respects him. Maybe both, as he ventures back into his lifestyle that he left behind one last time. Now, we're going to get into spoilers now, so if you've made it this far and still haven't seen it, please do. Okay, John Wick finally lies down after he is set free and dies. This is him going out on his own terms, choosing death instead of letting it come to him naturally. And at his funeral, the Bowery King asks Winston if he thinks John went to heaven or hell, and he responds with the only answer he can give. Who knows? It's left up to the imagination. I know there are some details that might hint towards Wick being alive, but honestly, I feel like there is nowhere else you can take his story. What else is there for Wick to accomplish, to gain, to earn? Wick's journey has all been leading up to this. There's nowhere else for him to go. So, in my eyes, his story is finished. It isn't just the ending that makes this movie, though. Its nearly 3-hour runtime has got to have a lot of stuff happening. And, yeah. Like I said, we have some amazing fights. And those fights are helped by the arrival of new characters. And this movie easily, without a doubt, has my favorite characters that aren't John himself. Akira and Vincent de Gramont are really good, though admittedly they pale in comparison to the others. In fairness, however, Vincent had one of my favorite villain defeats of all time. Hell, when John Wick shot that final bullet, I kid you not, everyone in my theater started clapping. I promise I'm not kidding. It's so satisfying. Back on track, let's talk about some of my new favorites. Killahar Khan is easily my favorite minor antagonist. He's basically just Wilson Fisk, who's extremely asthmatic and has a lot of pettiness. It's just so great. And the battle with him in the club is really good visually. Now that I think about it, John Wick has a lot of fights in clubs. I wonder what he's got against them. Kane is a contender for my favorite one-off character. Toph from Avatar: The Last Airbender is one of my favorite fictional characters ever, and part of the reason why is how the writers have to get so creative on how she fights given her disability. Of course, her character itself is most of the reason, but still. Kane is basically in the same boat as Toph, blind and seemingly at a disadvantage, but still a badass anyway, relying on other attributes beyond sight which make them a genuine threat to not underestimate. He has my favorite fighting style by far. You know, I just really like it when characters with disabilities or disadvantages just accepts the fact that they have that disadvantage and goes on being a badass anyway. I also really like the slight friendship he has with John. Kind of gives off a sort of friendly rivalry kind of vibe. Now, the final character I want to talk about is the other contender for my favorite one-off, Mr. Nobody. Kane is cool, but Nobody is the character who I want to see get their own spin-off the most. They exploited so much out of his character, and yet there's still a ton left to find out about him. They expand on the concept of Sophia using her dogs as fighting companions and go full force with it. I said that Kane was the most creative when it comes to fights, but nobody comes at a close second with his little buddy fighting alongside him. It's just great to see. And on top of that, he's just a really fun character overall. Man, this is far from a perfect movie, but I mean, what movie is? It was still a perfect conclusion to this saga. It was really great going through all of these movies, and I'm so glad that this was the one to cap it off. It's most definitely my favorite movie out of the franchise. It is a masterclass of a film, and an immaculate way to end John Wick's adventure for good. Hopefully, anyway. And there you have it, all the thoughts I have on these movies. I'm really glad I decided to make this video. It's nice to talk about different topics, and that's something I want to do a lot more of this year. I have a couple of plans for some, but I'll just have to see how it plays out. This franchise has become one of my favorite film series of all time. There isn't a single bad or even mediocre title from this bunch, and I really hope it stays that way as the franchise moves forward. I'm really immersed in this world now. I want to see more aspects of it. I definitely want to check out John Wick Hex and Ballerina when it comes out. I hope they delve into more games with John. I mean, a real-time action John Wick game would be sick. And yeah, I'm really glad I finally decided to check out this franchise for myself, because I was not disappointed. Thank each and every one of you for watching this. I'll be seeing you when Ant-Man vs. the Atom comes out, if it hasn't already. God, it's been too long. I can't wait for Death Battle to come back. See you then. I'm gonna go play Tears of the Kingdom now.